Welcome on the podcast, Karista. Uh, I'm really,
Thank you for having me.
I'm really happy to have you here for many reasons. I think the subject that we will talk about is really important because I think for the past few weeks, I realized I think I was living under the rock or something, but I didn't understand the importance of talking about toxic environment and everything that goes with it.
Hmm.
And when I fell on your podcast, Non-Compliant Enough, you were talking about so many different topics and the perception of each subject that you were talking about, it resonated with me a lot. I don't know, I had conversation with friends and I was talking about things that you were saying, and they said, yes, sometimes you leave you deal with things, but you don't know how to put words on it, or you don't know
Mm.
how to articulate it. But by listening to your podcast, not compliant enough, it was a great discovery. So I'm super happy and honored to have you here because I know you have like a wealth of knowledge and experiences. And I hope that you can share it a bit with the people that will listen to you.
Of
And yeah,
course.
thank you so much.
Oh,
You're doing an amazing job. No, you don't
mm.
know how your podcast felt like a safe space. I was just here listening, and it was as if like a little friend um, was murmuring words that would like console you. I don't know, it was a great feeling.
Oh, that means so much. Thank you so much. And I'm truly honored to be on your podcast.
Thank
This is
you.
lovely.
Yeah. So let's introduce yourself, who you are.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Karista. I have a podcast called Not Compliant Enough. I'm the founder of Intuitively Create. And I'm also birthing another creation called Coven of Calm, which is essentially to go into workplaces and teach people how to change their culture, how to shift their culture, how to have those uncomfortable conversations. We have lots of, different trainings and things like that people end up doing, which is like, mental health and resilience and empowering people. But we don't really get to the things that are really going on underneath. So that's sort of part of my work. And I guess how I got here is like I was in hospitality many moons ago. I was a beauty therapist. I've worked in federal government for like 12 years as an executive assistant. I've worked in national branding and marketing, as well as grants and all sorts of things. And so I've seen both ends of the scale. Like I've worked to CEOs, and being in those positions, like you have lots of people that are trying to look really good and they want to impress the CEO and everything like that. But then when you move from those positions into like one of the worker bees, no one wants to know you. And the information void is huge. And so, yeah, I think I really noticed just how much there wasn't any support out there for people, particularly when they are in those environments where they don't feel heard, they can't speak up, because essentially what happens is when they do speak up, they get punished for it. Like they don't get promoted, or, they get isolated. And yeah, I really do feel like these are topics that we need to be talking about more, because it's actually prolific and it's not just a particular country or a particular industry. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess that's a bit about me.
The first thing that was very compelling was the name of your podcast, Not
Hmm.
Compliant Enough. And there was a phrase that you said on your podcast. It hit me like a train on a track. It was like, are we being forced? Are we being pushed to be so compliant that we become complicit? But before
Mm.
talking about that phrase, tell us more about why naming your podcast and compliant enough, how it came, how was that process?
Such a good question. So I like just thought of a whole bunch of different like titles for the podcast. And as I mentioned before, I've worked in like marketing and branding. So those sorts of things I find really fun. And actually, it wasn't a name that I was really going to use because I was scared to use it, to be honest. Like, you know, when you're naming a podcast, you kind of need it to mean something that people can easily search as well. Like, because if it's too intelligent, people like are never going to find you. And if it's too basic, it's like everyone else has already called their podcast the same thing. So yeah, I came across, like, I don't know, it was just something that came to me, and I wrote down a whole bunch of things. And I actually had a session with Amy McNee from
Inspired Collective.
Inspired Collective, yeah. And yeah, like I took all my names and I was like, I'm really scared to use this. Like, what do you think? And she's like, yeah, do it. That's the one. And I'm like, it felt like the one. I just needed that, you know, that somebody else to bounce off. So yeah, and I guess part of the reason that it is called Not Compliant Enough is a little bit of a piss take on how workplaces want people to be compliant. Like, they want people to not speak up because it makes it easier for them. And so yeah, it was sort of like a bit of a, you know, a bit of a sticking the finger to the man, in a sense of being like, you know, I'm not going to be compliant. And I guess the other thing is, like, being in the public service for so long, I always felt like a bit of a square peg in a round hole. Like, I never felt like I fitted in, because there was all these people that would just like get on and do things and not question anything. And then when you question anything, you were kind of looked at like you were like there was something wrong with you. You know, it's like, why are you even questioning that? That's just the way we do things. So yeah, that's kind of how the name came to be. And thank you so much, because you're not the first person to comment about the name. And I think that that's what actually compels a lot of people to be like, oh wow, like, yeah, they get a bit excited about the name.
Yeah, because we don't realize, for instance, when we're in that system, we don't realize that there's little things that we are being compliant to. And this is helping the system to perpetuate that toxic environment. Sometimes we want to speak out, but sometimes I think we prefer not to. But at the same time, we are being complicit. What's your take on that? Like, how can we, as like a person, for instance, you know, a person will have to go on his workplace every day. So sometimes we have to find like that balance.
Yeah.
What's your take on that? Like, how not to be too compliant, but not complicit at the same time, you understand?
Yeah, like, you still want to keep your job, right? Like, you still got bills to pay. And I think it's a really interesting space to kind of to pull apart and think about too, because obviously there's some things that you have to be compliant about, which are legislated policies, and, you know, depending on what country it is, there's different like legalities around things. So there's those sorts of things that do need to be upheld, and like they can't be changed. But I think part of what frustrates so many people, and part of the issue with a lot of our companies, are the systems that they have internally that don't make sense, that have been kind of amorphed over many years but never really been questioned. And so much of that, from what I see, is like their reactions. So they're like, oh, this was going bad, so this is the reactive band-aid solution that we're going to put onto that. But then nothing actually gets any better, and there's no preventative measures in place. And I think that that's when it comes down to particularly people burning out and mental health issues and all of those sorts of things. You know, the onus is put on the individual, and that's not necessarily like what it should be either, because it's not always an individual fault. It's actually a systemic issue. And if your environment is being that you're not, you know, like, say you're in a company, for instance, and there's all these impossible deadlines, and it's just work upon work upon work, and they expect you to work weekends and after hours and all of the rest of it just to get it done for these arbitrary deadlines. And then you wonder why your people are burnt out and they're not coping so well with their mental health. And then you're telling them as an individual that you need to sort your own shit out because your mental health is the, you know, like, you're burning yourself out and your mental health is the issue. when actually, like, say that person is going to therapy and they are doing all the things, they're doing the meditation and the, you know, breath work and whatever else works for them, but it's actually the environment that they're in. And so, you know, those perpetuate bad behaviors, but it also makes people compliant in a way because they don't feel like there's any help out there. They're not supported. And so that is what happens, is that they become compliant and complicit because they know they're not going to be heard. And that is the biggest thing. So it's actually, you know, beyond the systems not working and beyond all of the things, it comes back to the very, very core of it, where people don't feel seen, they don't feel heard, and they don't feel respected. And that goes both ways. You know, you can't demand respect unless you're offering respect. You can't trust people if you're trying to, you know, you don't trust them working from home and you're wanting to record them all the time. You know, like it goes both ways. And so, you know, you can't demand people to kind of toe the line when you're not, as a company, you know, your leaders are not leading with that either. They're not leading with compassion or empathy or really actually meaningfully caring about people. They're just kind of, for want of a better word, being dictators in a way and being like, this is how it is. And you either like it or lump it. See you later. And I think, you know, these are very nuanced conversations. It obviously depends on where you work and the types of people in that industry, but also the intention of the company. Like, as a company, how do you want your culture to be? And I think that that's the part that's missing. You know, all this culture talk, a lot of it is by osmosis. Like, you know, some people have different ideas of what culture looks like. And so when that is not articulated in a very meaningfully way, it makes it really hard for people. Like, you know, people think of things in different ways. Like, we all perceive the world in our, you know, through our own experiences, through our own upbringings, through our own environments. And so I think, you know, you look at it culturally, you've got, you know, say Japan, for instance, is a very, you know, they're very subservient, very respectful. And they also look to their leaders as the people who, you know, what their leader does, they will follow. Like that is, you know, that's part of how they do business and things like that too. And so when we have all of those things, we see that there's cultures that make it harder to speak out about stuff too, because it's not allowed at all. Like, and I think that, you know, with the younger generation coming through and the new types of companies that are being built, I think that it is a perfect time to be setting different intentions. And the companies that don't get on board with actually trying to make it a bit more of an open conversation instead of a totalitarian environment are going to be the ones that actually thrive. Like, and that's just the reality. I mean, here in Australia, you know, everyone's saying that, oh, we can't get staff and, you know, it's really hard to find staff at the moment and all the rest of it. But if you are not creating an environment that employees actually want to be in, then you're not going to find anyone. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how much money you throw at them, how many of these benefits you throw. Like, if you're trying to make people submissive in a way that they can't show up and be their full self at work, then it doesn't matter what you do. Like, people have choices now. And I think that's the biggest thing. Like, you know, a generation before us were very compliant and complicit in that way because, you know, it was a different time. There was a different mindset. And we've had the internet now. We've got so many other options. Like, people can set up their own businesses. They can make money off TikTok and YouTube and, you know, all of these other avenues. And so if you have a business and a company and you're trying to get staff in and employees in, you need to be really showing them, like, you know, what is the benefit of coming and working for you? What is the reciprocal arrangement? It's not just this one-way street. And I think so much of it as well is there's a mindset. And I know that I've come across this with different people as well. When you when you go for interviews and different things, like through your time, you notice this so much is some people and some companies kind of go, oh, well, we're paying you, so we own you, like, and there's that real sort of ownership type of thing, like with this mindset of like, well, this is what I'm paying you to do. And I think that that's just so limiting, like it really is so limiting and so very transactional. And these relationships, because they are relationships, like we spend so much time at work. I mean, depending on what you do and all that sort of thing, but the majority of people, I think it would be quite a good assumption to say that most people spend the majority of their time at work. And when those environments aren't nice and when you can't be yourself, you find that, of course, people are depressed because they have to repress who they are in order to show up every day to an office or a workplace, whatever that looks like for them, to try and fit in. It's like you look at, and you can see it through children as well, like when they start going to school, and how, they've gone from being this really outgoing, like, really creative sort of individual to trying to do things to please others, or introverted, or they become really people pleasing and they'll just go along with the crowd. And I think that, that really is sort of an environment that sets people up for these types of more kind of, those sort of like workplace environments where you're just told what to do and that's the end of it. Like there's no two-way discussion. Yeah.
I think what she said is really interesting is like nowadays, like through various conversation, I've noticed that there's not much like inspired environment. And as you said, there's more like a totalitarian management style where you don't have to ask questions. You can't ask questions because you don't have the venue. You understand? So, and I think we can regroup everything into something you call the psychological safety. You mentioned on your podcast, and I think it's very interesting because as long as there's no psychological safety, we won't be able to feel like we can be true to ourselves in a working place. We will be afraid to speak out, afraid of being humiliated. So according to you, what can like a company do in order to create that sense of psychological safety where I can voice out my opinions, I can voice out my struggles without feeling judged? How can a company just implement something for psychological safety?
Look, I think that's a really good question. But actually, I think the more important question is, why do people feel like they can't speak up in your company? Like that's actually where you need to start off with. It's not about putting, a new thing in place and being like, oh, we're going to do this now. I remember working in an organization and, this is when human-centered design came in. And so everyone had to do this human-centered design, these programs and learn about it, and then start with the Kanbans and, the check-ins and all these sorts of things. And it's really interesting to witness because when you put those types of these new things into a company and you haven't really transitioned to that in a very meaningful way, it just becomes another tick box thing that people are doing. It doesn't actually work. It's like reading a book and not implementing the learnings that you got from it. It's the same kind of thing, right? And so when it comes to psychological safety, it's actually more important to tease out what is really going on underneath and why people don't feel safe enough to speak up. And generally, just from what I've observed and witnessed and, with the people that I've worked with, it's usually a couple of particular individuals that maybe have been there quite a long period of time. There's usually a little bit of a click going on, and they're the ones that are the most outspoken people that it doesn't matter if other people talk up. They're the ones that are usually like, no, you're wrong. This is how it is. Or my opinion matters more than yours. I even had this incident with a colleague who basically told me that because I hadn't been to university, she knew more than I did about a particular thing. So I think there's a lot of power plays that happen in organizations, and when you get to psychological safety is not something that you just implement. It's like building trust. You know, you don't just build trust in an instant. It is through those micro moments, through every single day, through every single interaction. You know, the reputation of your company is built, and your brand, or however you want to say it, is built through those micro moments too. So say you're a company and you're not paying your invoices on time. You know, what does that look like to the other companies that you're dealing with? It doesn't give you a very good reputation, but it also doesn't create a very good environment either for a working relationship. And it's the same thing with employees within your organization. You know, you can't do the promotional thing and be like, oh, this is how we are and we're amazing, but internally we're a hot mess. And that's where the psychological safety really comes into play, because it's like, well, you know, and I must say, like, psychological safety was a term coined by, I can't remember her name. There's a book actually, and we can add it into I'll send it to you to add into the show notes. But I think it's Amy Edmondson, and she's the one that actually kind of coined the phrase psychological safety. And there's reports and studies that have been done through Google. But in her book, and part of the studies around psychological safety, she thought that because there's psychological safety, which means that people can speak up and are not afraid to speak up. There was a study done in a hospital environment. So it was like emergency response, and, you know, around like hospital nursing sort of thing. One hospital had psychological safety and the other one didn't. And the one that did, they were the one that actually had more incident responses of things that had gone wrong, right? Whereas the other one didn't. And the reason for that is because this other company with the, you know, the more emergency responses of things that had gone wrong was because people felt safe enough to tell their colleagues and their bosses and whatever what was actually going on. Whereas the other company were trying to hide it because they were too scared to actually say what was happening and what was going wrong. So, you know, beyond implementing psychological safety as a standard in your organization, the thing about it is that when you do have that, it means that you can fix things in a much more cohesive way. And you're going to have that holistic approach to your organization, as opposed to people hiding things and, you know, either lying about stuff or, you know, just not telling the whole truth about what's really going on because they're too afraid of the consequences of what's going to happen to them. And I mean, that's actually what's going on in so many places, which is heartbreaking. Like, that's what really breaks my heart, is that there's so many people in so many of these companies that they're literally, their soul is being destroyed because they can't speak their truth and they don't feel like anyone's got their back. They don't feel like anyone can help them, and they have to sit there and suffer in silence. Mm-hmm. And I saw this, particularly a friend of mine who worked in an airline industry. Obviously during COVID, they were one of the first people to be stood down, so they didn't have a job. And they went on to go work in one of the big banks here in Australia. And I saw this person who is a very outgoing, very like gregarious, really fun loving, you know, go from that like person that they are to go into this very stuffy environment, working in a call center, being like, even their toilet breaks were tracked for time and everything like that. All their phone calls are tracked for time. Like, they had to meet certain KPIs, all of these sorts of things. And I witnessed that person go from the person that they were to almost a shell of themselves. Like, they hated everything. And they were like, I don't know how people do this, you know? And that was just putting one person from one environment into the other. and you can see the difference. And so when we have safety in those environments for people to be themselves, but also to speak up, and it's not in a way of like, oh, everything's bad and, you know, like all of these things. It's actually trying to make things better.
Yeah.
Because the more voices you have in trying to solve things, the better it is. I mean, just because you're a manager doesn't mean that you have the answer. Just because you're a leader doesn't mean that you have the right answer. Like someone who might be, you know, one of your little worker bees who can see things from a different perspective, or maybe they're on the front line talking to customers, so they hear things from a different perspective that isn't in isolation to the middle management or just the leadership. They're the ones that have some of the better ideas because they can see what it's like from the other side. So they give that perspective, whereas customers don't usually get the opportunity to speak to, you know, the leaders or the decision makers in an organization as a general rule, because, you know, that's what other people do. But yeah, I just think there's more to the story than just implementing psychological safety. Like there is the question of, you know, why don't people feel safe here? And what is it about either the people, the makeup of the team, the environment? Like, why can't they, you know, feel safe enough to voice either opinions or voice things to make things better? Mm-hmm. I think that's the really important piece. And I also feel like part of that is that we as a society have become really bad at having like hard conversations. We're very avoidant. People avoid having hard conversations. Like, I mean, it's like dating, right? You see it. Like, you know, people don't even really do dating anymore. They do it on apps. You know, it's like swipe here, swipe there.
Gratification.
Yeah. Like instant gratification, but also, you know, and I must say I'm not really on dating apps because I find them awful. But I do have a lot of friends that have been on them, and, you know, like the ghosting that happens, it's like you'll go out on one date and then you just never hear from that person again. And they don't even have like you know, that they don't even have like,
audacity to, okay, like,
yeah. Well, to even turn around and be like, look, you know, it was really nice, but I'm just not that into you or whatever. Yeah. We've lost that art of having a conversation. And like, I mean, I don't know if that's like an internet thing or whatever, like, you know, or we've just become really lazy, or we just have never really been very good at having hard conversations. But we do need to have those conversations because that's where so much of this gets lost. And, you know, I just think that, and in my experiences, like, you know, I like, well, dealing with different situations and things like that, you realize that a lot of managers don't even want to have a conversation with their staff. They try and outsource it to HR. And all of this is just about having a real conversation with someone. Like, if you've got an issue with me, I'd rather you come and speak to me as opposed to talking to HR and then getting them to speak to me about something that they have no idea about, you know, like, yeah. So I think there's a lot of that kind of goes on. And yeah, we've just become really avoidant in having conversations, which makes it challenging to have that psychological safety because you can't even have that conversation with someone. And so, you know, you can't build trust if people can't even have a conversation.
Yeah.
Like,
I think maybe one of the reasons why it's hard to have those type of conversation, because you have to sit down and think about your character, think about your action, and maybe people are not ready to, you know, do like a deconstruction of who they are. You understand what I mean? They're not ready to think about their character and actions, how, and I don't know, maybe that's the issue. I think they're not ready to change.
I do feel that's definitely a big part of it. I actually feel the other part of it is that companies aren't willing to admit their own actions have such an impact on things either. So when companies change things, they'll usually come out with like talking points, and everyone has to stick to the talking points and all of those sorts of things. Like they stick to the lines. It's kind of like politicians stick to a line when they're, you know, election campaigns and whatever. And so when people ask questions outside of that, it becomes very hard for them to actually have a real conversation when you don't have any real answers to go with it. And so, yes, it is about the individual's character and them owning what they're doing as a person, but also having the self-awareness. And I think it's part of the emotional maturity as well. Like, there's not a lot of emotional maturity out there. I think that's actually a big thing. Like, yeah, everyone talks about you know, the EQ, like, yeah, they talk about EQ and all of that, like emotional intelligence, but they don't talk about emotional maturity. And I really feel like that is the difference. Like, sure, you can have emotional intelligence, whatever, like, but it's the maturity of being able to not only recognize what you've done, but also see from the other person's perspective and how those actions have impacted them.
That's interesting, the emotional maturity. And the thing about how your actions can destroy someone. The other day I was listening to a video and I was like, wow, the person said, like, you know, your words is like when you take a paper and smash it, okay? This is the impact of words. And when you open that paper, it will never go back to where it was before, like a flat paper. There will be like, you know, it will be like crunchy. So sometimes we realize how our words can cut people down, can destroy someone, and it's very, very hard. You understand what I mean? And
absolutely.
It's sad that, as you said, before implementing psychological safety, we have to feel safe. And I think because of the clicks, you know, someone knows another person, so the managers knows the team leader, they have a good relationship. So how can another person, a third party, come and say, you know, that team leader, that manager is not doing a good job in managing my work or in talking with me, you understand? So maybe there should be like a third party in companies where we can feel more at ease to speak. So it will be like an intermediate person.
Yeah.
It would have been more easier, I think, because talking to the HR, knowing that the HR is a good friend of the manager most of the time. So it becomes difficult sometimes to
absolutely. HR is literally there to protect the company. Like, that's what HR's role is. It's to protect the company. So HR are not actually there to necessarily help the employees as much as they profess that they do, in my experience and from what I've witnessed. And I mean, I worked in HR for a period of time as well, is that, you know, a lot of people in HR are just there to make managers happy. They're not there to really help the employees. And I mean, in what you were saying about like the relationships and things like that, I mean, when I was working in HR, I was looking after a whole bunch of executive assistants, and I had one executive assistant have huge issues with the person that she was working for. They just didn't click, right? It just wasn't a good relationship. And so I was like, look, that's fine. We'll just try and find, you know, it's like a work marriage, like the executive and an executive assistant. If that doesn't work and if that's disjointed, it's never going to work. And I used to joke that it was like a work marriage, because it kind of is. Like, you're looking after that person's life in a sense. And, you know, I moved that person into I found a different executive that needed someone there. So she transitioned into that role and loved it. Was a completely different person. And so those relationships matter. And if you don't get those relationships right, that is really detrimental. And I know that people are like, oh, look, you can't pick who you work with and da, 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 da. But you still need to be able to have a like respectful and, you know, cohesive relationship going on. And if that's not there, it can severely impact you as a person. yeah, all those clicks, they like, that really has a huge impact on people. And I don't know that you can really like, I don't think that you can really get rid of a lot of those clicks sometimes because they're so ingrained. It's kind of like high school. You know, they're like the little high school groups.
Yes.
Everyone had their little group in high school. And yeah, I think a lot of that kind of ends up happening organically in workplaces. But I think the difference is if you have management that are aware of that and are willing to have those hard conversations and be like, look, you know, you can have those relationships and those friendships, but you can't do it in a work sense where you are excluding people, because that's not okay, or isolating them, or not giving them work because you just don't like them. You know, those little things that happen that are really hard to, even if you were to go to HR, it's hard to articulate. It's hard to have the words to say because, you know, you can feel what's happening and you can witness what's happening, but because they're really good at managing up and promoting themselves and showing other people that they're doing all this stuff, it makes it hard to, you know, say like, I'm actually being bullied in a way where it's not overt, it's covert. And it's very insidious, you know, and I'm just going to say it, like, this is very controversial, but it's my experience. Like, women are the worst at this. Women are cruel people, particularly to other women. Like, I mean, you know, I can work with guys, like guys I find so much easier to work with. And yes, of course, there is, you know, there has been like sexual harassment and things like that in the past. But to be honest, I mean, like, and this is the bad thing, it's like as women, we get used to that because that is the world that we live in. But yeah, women to other women is actually worse. Like, that hurts more. And I think because we feel like women should be there to support us because they've been through it as well. But actually they're just worse. And those cliques, I think, are very, very cruel. And they're very good at being very covert. I think that's the difference. Whereas, like, you know, when it's sexual harassment and things like that, it's a little bit more overt. Like, people witness that and you can see it, you know. Whereas when it's like women just having those really underhanded remarks and, you know, bitching behind other people's backs and all those sorts of things, and you're hearing through the grapevine what other people are saying about you, like, that's when it becomes really quite cruel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You said something really interesting about that. Women are over-mentored and under-championed. You said that in an episode of, I think it was Women Are Real Bitches.
Yeah.
Episode was great. Over-mentored, under-championed. It summarized everything.
Look, I can't claim to have come up with that phrase at all because it was Cindy Gallop who said that women are, over mentored and under championed. And yeah, like, they are. I mean, and I think that also comes down to, you know, I think that there's just an inherent bias as well. Like, as a society, we have lots of biases. So, you know, when you close your eyes and think of a doctor, or you close your eyes and think of a lineup of people who are criminals who are about to go to jail, you know, like, what's the first images that you get? And I think that there's a lot of inherent biases that we have around what leadership looks like, and, you know, what particular people, you know, are in different roles. And so I do feel like, you know, women are definitely underrepresented in a lot of respects, but also diversity is completely underrepresented. Like, you know, there's definitely a particular type of people that are always put into particular things. And, you know, I find I get really annoyed at like these diversity and inclusion things a lot of the time because it's so tokenistic. Like, it's not meaningful. And the people that do end up being in those roles know that it's not meaningful. you know, they know that they're a representative of a particular minority and whatever that minority might be, but it's also not meaningful. And so until we're taking those seriously, and until we're being like, you know, it's not just diversity for the sake of it, then, you know, none of it's going to be equal. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. We're not going to have true equality or anything, unless everyone's championed. It's not just women, it's everyone. You know, like here in Australia, we have a particular lot of, you know, there's lots of programs for Indigenous Australians. And I've got friends who have been in those programs and things like that. And, you know, they're incredible. Like I had one of my staff, actually, he was just so great. And I was like, mate, you could do my job. Like, I don't know why I'm here. Like, you should be doing my job. Like, you're literally at that level. And he'd been held back because he'd come in through a particular stream of, you know, these like placements and all that sort of thing. And, you know, it's really heartbreaking because you see these people who are pouring their heart and soul into it, and they feel like they have to do more because they've come in as a minority type of, you know, during these representative programs. And, you know, they belong in much higher positions. They belong being there in leadership positions as well. And so, you know, it's not just women, but everyone, you know, we need to be championing more people in a more diverse way, because we're not getting the voices at the table that we need. And that is also why people can't speak up, because if you can't see, like, how can you be that? Like, if we don't have that representation there, and in a meaningful way, not just in this tokenistic, because that's what pisses me off even more. Like, it's like, I get on my soapbox about that, because it's like, if you're going to do it, just do it. Like, don't be tokenistic about it. You know, like these women's days, these, you know,
I don't
harmony days, all this other stuff. Yeah.
Just to show off. You understand what I mean? It's just to show
Yeah,
off.
totally.
It's day we love each other, but every day you're having like a bad attitude. You're portraying your insecurities on other people. And today you're celebrating Women's Day. I think it's very hypocrite. And
Absolutely.
it's like the wellness thing, as you said, it's like just like an undercover. So we are having like a wellness event today, or you will have to fill up surveys for data purposes. But what are we doing at the end of the day? Are you taking care of our mental health on a daily basis? So it's such you know, when you go out of the system and you see it from like a bird eye view, you say, okay, that's ridiculous. You understand what I mean? And
absolutely, it's completely ridiculous.
How can we shake up the system so they realize, okay, wellness is not about just surveys and everything. It's a two-way, like two-way conversation. Let's have the conversation.
Yeah. And this is what it comes back to, right? Like, people are too scared to have those hard conversations. But also when it comes to surveys, like, I don't know about you, but I know that when I have like spoken with colleagues in the past about surveys, like, no one is truthful on surveys because they don't believe them to be like anonymous. They're never anonymous.
Yeah.
You know, you can totally be identified in a survey. So it comes back down to that psychological safety aspect of like, people are too scared to speak up, and they're not going to do it via a survey either, because they know that they're going to be targeted. And there's the repercussions about it. Exactly. So, you know, surveys are not the panacea of like finding out everything and being like the magical answer to what's going on in your organization. They're one method and one activity that you could possibly do. And that's the other thing, like, you know, when it comes to these like morning teas and these chats and all the rest of it, like, there's so much chatting, you know, there's lots of talk fest, but there's not a lot of action that goes on. And it's so hypocritical. Like, you know, you watch all these CEOs, and I only name CEOs because, you know, I've worked with a lot of them, so I've seen that quite close. But, you know, you could say it for any of the management, really. Like, they'll go to some big, you know, big kind of industry conference, right? And they'll talk on stage about how amazing their organization is. They'll talk about all these wellness things that they've done and how fabulous it is and all this stuff. But actually, if you talk to anyone that worked there, the place is dysfunctional.
Mm-mm.
It is toxic. It's entirely dysfunctional, but yet they've got some program that they've implemented that, because they've done surveys, everyone's telling them that it's amazing because they're too scared to tell them the truth.
Yeah. And there's another thing about values, like all companies have values, but you preach about your values, but it's not what we see on a day-to-day. So that's a concern. Your values does not align with the actions in your company.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you say that, because I had that exact conversation with an executive in a company that I worked in. So like, for some context, and I cover this like in detail in my podcast, I had a miscarriage and was moved into a different area. And this was all during lockdown and whatnot. And I actually sat down with I had a video meeting with one of the leaders of the organization. And I did, as part of that meeting, outline the values that were purported as part of the organization. And part of that was truth and integrity. And I was like, well, where is the truth here? And also, where's the integrity? Because these are constant actions that are happening. And I outlined a few other things. And you're telling me that that leader is not being, like, where's the accountability? Because there doesn't seem to be a lot of accountability to the values that are spoken about. And that, I think, is what happens in a lot of organizations. And, so many of them outsource their values. Like, I had a conversation the other week of someone who was telling me that there was some consulting firm that was like doing all the values for their organization. Like, they've outsourced it so that no one within the organization who actually works there has any input. So how can you have these values that no one has been on the journey to actually like go, okay, yeah, that I agree with that. And it's a two-way street. Like, if you have values in your organization, you need to have your employees on board with that too. Like, they need to be part of that conversation. They need to be part of that journey in actually developing them. It can't just be this top-down approach. It needs to be a bottom-up, and you need to kind of work it out in the middle there. There's, some companies actually, there's one company in particular, I spoke with their owner, and they actually call them virtues instead of values, because it was more meaningful for them. Because with virtues, you can actually be like, well, these are the actions that align to that. Like, this is what you need to be showing and what you need to be embodying. And so I do think values get overused in a very like, it's a bit of a talk fest, to be honest. Like, yeah, and it can be done so much better. But also, like, what's the point of having values if you're not even going to stick to them? They're just words on a wall.
And sometimes companies will judge your performance as per the values, or you following the values, or us following the values, but is the company following the values? And I think you mentioning the story you went through about the miscarriage. So I heard that episode on your podcast, and I want to thank you for being that vulnerable on that episode, because your story goes to show how sometimes in the workplace we can be inhumane. And that's, I will never understand, because someone going through a hardship and you just don't show any compassion. I think compassion should be like a value, a culture in the company. But thanks so much for sharing
thank you.
that vulnerable part on that podcast. And I highly recommend people to listen to that, because so much needed. And thank you. Thank you, Karista.
Thank you. Well, do you know, I think part of sharing that was not to, like, it wasn't really to kind of, you know, it's not a naming and shaming thing or anything like that. But what it does help to really highlight is these conversations that we just don't have. And so many women, and not just women, but like, you know, partners, like people are in all different situations, particularly going through different losses, like be it pregnancy, be it family losses, be it whatever. I think particularly in the last couple of years, we've seen how, you know, our worlds have changed so massively, and we can't go back to the way that it was, pretending like this stuff doesn't go on. And yeah, like it definitely does highlight how companies need to be more attuned to what's really going on with their staff. Like, you know, I actually come back to that same leadership conversation that I had. And when I divulged that information to that particular leader, she turned around and told me that she didn't want to hear about it. She didn't need to know about it. And I was like, no, you actually do need to know about it, because this is why, and this is the context. And that's the thing, like we miss the context. You know, like when people are going through some things, maybe they're not showing up and they're not doing their best, you know, they're not being their best self. It's kind of like, well, where is the love? You know, like I heard Black Eyed Peas on the radio just before, and I was like, that is such a great song. Like, you listen to the lyrics of Where is the Love? And I mean, that was in 2003 that they released that. And all of those lyrics hold true today. Like, we're still in that point, and it's sort of like, where is the love? Where is the compassion? And I just hope that companies can get to a point, and, you know, people in general can get to a point where there's a bit more compassion.
Yeah. Yeah. That would be much needed. That would be much needed. And, you know, there was something that I've observed is about boundaries as well. Is like boundaries are hardly being respected in the workplace. We feel guilt for wanting a day off, a sick.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can go to the HR and say, you know, because of my mental health, I need to take a sick. I think there's still like stigma on mental health. So managers will say, no, you can't take a day off because there's a lot of work. But a workplace should be able to work without a particular employee. So it shows that there is an issue with the system. So I had a chat with a friend, and he said to me, you know, Mary Grace, I went through a hard time last week and I wanted to take a day off. And he told me, you know, my colleagues told me not to take a day off because it would show that you are not a good manager. So when he told me that, there was something in my heart that was like, so now taking a day off because of your mental health shows that you're not a good manager. So that's very hard, I think. And it goes to show that there's a long way to go.
So much. And actually, like, you know, that's heartbreaking also, because as a manager, you are meant to be setting that example for your employees as well. So if you as a manager are not taking a day off for your mental health, how do you expect your employees and the people in your team to feel comfortable enough to take a day off if they're having a hard time? You know, like it's about setting that example in a way. And I know that that's like really cliche and all the rest of it, but working with high level executives, it can never be underestimated how much people take notice of other people's actions and their behaviors. And so if you are setting an example and being like, you know what, I'm going through a hard time right now, I need to take a couple of days off to kind of deal with that, that speaks more volumes of being able to break down the stigma of talking about mental health and things than this stoicism and being like, no, you just need to show up, just pretend like nothing's going on, you know, like just keep going, just push through, you'll be fine. You know, it's like grief and things like that. Like, you know, we get uncomfortable having these conversations. We get uncomfortable with having a conversation about mental health or someone losing a loved one, or someone going through a divorce, or, you know, going through a hard time. And I mean, there's a whole range of things that people go through. But to almost gaslight them and be like, well, you can't take time off because that's going to look bad, is not supportive.
Yeah.
And it is actually, it makes it worse, because then you feel like you've got to push through to the point of beyond burnout. And that's when you get really sick. And believe me, I know, I've been there. Hand up. I was that person, you know, like push through, like, yeah. And there's nothing good that comes of it. So yeah, I mean, I think there definitely needs to be a lot more conversations, but a lot more meaningful action, and a bit more respect to the nuance of things that are going on for people.
Yeah.
Because we have a perfect storm going on right now. We have economic issues. People can't make ends meet. We've got rents rising. We've got bills rising. We've got food rising. You know, people's wages aren't going up to meet these rising costs. And so you're going to have a lot more people struggling. And that is just the basics. Like, that's just living, surviving, let alone other things that go on, like chronic health issues or circumstances that happen. So, you know, there's definitely room for some more compassion, but also to, you know, I actually think so much of this comes down to an emotional maturity, right? Because the maturity to have an adult conversation, and I mean, when I say adult, I mean having a conversation that is not like, you did this and you did that and me. This is like actually sitting down and being like, I can see that you're going through a hard time right now, and it's okay to take some time off. And I would encourage you to do that. Like, I had a staff member of mine who lost a family member just before Christmas. And we were in a really, like, my team was so busy. Like, we were under the pump. And when she called me and told me that she had a loss in her family, I was like, take off as much time as you need. Like, tell me how I can support you. You know, I'll check in on you next week just to see how you're going, if that's okay. But like, you know, I don't want you to stress about work. We'll just make it work. Right. And I had my manager turn around and say to me, when's that person coming back to work? And I was like, I don't know. She's like, what do you mean you don't know? I go, I don't know. She just lost a family member. I'm not forcing her to give me a date of when she's going to come back to work. Like, she needs to go do what, you know, go be with her family and not worry about this nonsense, because that's what it is. Like, it's you wanting to control a situation that you can't control. You know, we need to have some compassion for people, and you can't control situations. Like, that's just the reality. Things are going to happen. Like, I think if anything, the last couple of years have taught us that there's no way that you can control things. Like, we just need to roll with those waves, and that's sort of life, right? Like, you know, it doesn't fit into a nice, perfect little box. Like, you can't just plan it and it's going to go this way and that's it. Like, there's so many other factors that happen. And that's the beauty of life too. I mean, you know, it's those little miracles that happen, those little, you know, synchronistic moments, the serendipity of what could happen. And we lose that when we're trying to squeeze the life out of things and when we're trying to control things, you know?
True. And the system itself sometimes at work is not prone to, you know, having that feeling good. I mean, for instance, what I've noticed, and I don't know at your workplace or anywhere else, it's like sometimes you have the key jobs, you understand? So the key jobs, sometimes there's like one people, and sometimes I try to put myself in their place. It's like everything is on them. Okay. But what happens if they want to take like a day off or just want to relax? because they know they have like a workload. So I think there needs to be a change in the system so that everyone can feel they can take a break at any moment.
Yeah,
So they
absolutely.
don't burn out.
So yeah, so the really interesting thing, and I think that, okay, so the tech companies that, you know, are obviously doing a lot of layoffs at the moment, so not the best example, but they are very good with the asynchronistic work, right? So if you look at some of the tech companies and how they've actually set up their organizations so that people can work across the world at the same time, it means that you have to outline your systems and the way that you do things in a much more cohesive way. And that's where a lot of companies haven't done that, because they have people in there who take over these jobs and then they make it theirs and they get very protectionist of that job. And so they're the only one that knows how to do certain things. And it makes it hard for other people to do stuff, which is why they can't take the time off, because they're either in an environment that causes them to be very protectionist because other people are trying to undermine them, which is a lot of workplaces, let's be honest. And so that's why it becomes very protectionist, and why a lot of people don't feel like they can take time off, because they're the only ones that do things and they've got a huge workload. They also need to prove themselves and all the other things that go with it. When you look at the way a lot of tech companies have set up, particularly for remote work, and like, I mean proper remote work. I don't mean like this bullshit hybrid stuff where they're like, we want you to come into the office 3 days a week and you can work from home a couple of days a week. But like, you know, we're helping you out working from home. Like it's just like, it's location change. It's not proper working from home. When you're looking at proper remote work, it means that those systems are outlined in a very cohesive way, and you can like know where stuff is at. I think it's Cal Newport has an incredible book, and he's done a few. There's one around emails and different things like that, like the death of emails. I can't remember the name of it exactly, but Cal Newport has some great literature around this like remote work type thing, and also deep work. He has a great book called Deep Work, and it's about how we're so, you know, reactive with things, and we don't actually have that space to do that really deep thinking work anymore, because everything's so quick and, you know, needs to be done. But it's not done in a really good way, because we don't have the time to think about it, to have the space to really like comprehend things. And so the reason that a lot of these systems don't work is because most of them aren't actually documented. And with a lot of these companies that do remote work, I'm pretty sure it's Cal Newport. Anyway, it was one particular book that I read, and it was about a company that it didn't matter where they were in the world. So say they were making videos, and they had different people as part of that process. They had different like systems in place that they could, it didn't matter what time of the day it was in their location. So they could be anywhere in the world. They could log in, find out where that particular project was up to, do their part of it, and then let people know that their part was done for that project, that then someone else could, you know, log in and keep working, or they could work on it at the same time or whatever. They had systems in place to make it work well. And I'm pretty sure GitLab, there's a guy who used to be at GitLab called Darren Murph, who's great to follow on LinkedIn. And he actually talks about a lot of the asynchronistic work and how to do remote work in a really, really good way. And that's where a lot of these systems break down. So that's why you have the protectionist people that don't feel like they can take time off, because the systems aren't set up in a way that actually helps them do that. Yeah.
And as you said, there are people as well who are gatekeepers. So they don't want another person to know their job, so they can become like the irreplaceable person. So sometimes it's both ways. Like, yes, the company needs to create a system where anyone can take a holiday when they want, but people as well should be able to understand that, okay, it's in your advantage that someone else knows your job.
I mean, look, it is absolutely that. And also, you know, if you're not training people underneath you to take your job, then what are you doing as a manager? Like, that is the whole point of it. It's like you should be training people to step up. And that's the whole point of these systems. But also, I do feel like a lot of people, there's a deep insecurity there. And that's actually what underlies a lot of these behaviors, is that they're very insecure.
Mm.
Be it that they feel insecure in their job, where they fear that someone else will do it better and they will be made, you know, like redundant or moved somewhere else. Or it does come back to that psychological safety aspect, in that like they're insecure because it's not a safe place to work in.
Yeah. Back to
you know.
Mm-mm.
And it's back to the root of the issue. I think that there's so many fancy terms and fancy words that you could slap onto all of these things, but it's like putting, you know, makeup on something and not dealing with the underlying issues. You know, it's like taking Panadol or, you know, painkillers for something, but not actually fixing what's really going on underneath. And so, yeah, like without doing that, nothing's going to change.
Yes.
Mm-mm. Without getting to the underneath, there is no change.
Mm-mm. True. And since we were talking about boundaries, there's another thing that I think now is becoming more and more present, is like this blurred line between home and work life, that amalgamation of home and work life. I don't know how it is in Sydney, but in Mauritius, for instance, you will have like managers and people in high position that will get a phone from the company just so they can separate both, okay? But you'll get people, for instance, executive or general employees who might not get a phone. But what I observe is that, for instance, most of the work, they have like a WhatsApp group. I don't know if it's the same.
Yep.
So you have that WhatsApp group and you don't have a company phone, okay? And each time you're here unwinding, talking with your friends or just on WhatsApp scrolling, you get those notifications about work. I don't know,
Yeah.
there's a campaign here. So even when you're at home, trying to relax and not think about your job, you're getting like a constant reminder because your managers and team leaders are pumping that WhatsApp group with work. It's like as if that line is so blurred. It's like, am I really disconnecting when I'm at home? So what's your take on that?
Oh, such a good topic. Like, I love this. So I absolutely hate, and I will use hate, those WhatsApp groups. They are awful. They're so annoying because they're just nonsense a lot of the time. You'll have a couple of people who like want to share about all their kids and on the weekend and everything like that as well. And I'm like, babe, you know what? I really don't care. Like, that's really lovely, but I don't care. Like, I work with you. I have my own friends. I have my own like life outside of this. Like, I don't need to know about your kids on a weekend or their football match or what. Like, I don't care. But there's definitely lots of oversharers in those situations. So some really, really good things that I implemented for setting boundaries or better boundaries was I turn off all my notifications on my phone, all notifications, like turn all of them off. And you can actually turn off particular like group notifications as well.
Yeah, you can mute
So
it. That's what I
you
do.
can mute, yeah, you can mute the groups. You know, so yeah, like I think turning all of those off is really helpful. I do know the difference as well, because like I went from a job where I did have two phones, and so I could separate it really quite easily, to then only having one phone and going through that. And then I think on top of that, because everyone's like gone through this period where, and I would hazard a guess that most of the world dealt with like this whole work from home situation, like as a collective at the same time. And we're still learning what that looks like, you know, and I think that it is challenging. I do know that a lot of people, particularly during lockdown periods, found it like really useful to kind of go for a morning walk, or like, you know, doing something in the morning to get out, and then this is your work time, and then having like that switch off time where they go for a run or walk or for a swim, or, you know, doing something in the afternoon that kind of takes you away from that, and like, and you're completely disconnecting. I think it depends on the organization too, and it depends on how people get listened to, because this also comes down to so much of this communication and being heard.
Yes.
And so when, you know, like I remember, so I was really concerned for the mental health of my staff because they were like really under the pump. We had, you know, incredible deadlines, and it was actually impossible. Like it was, these arbitrary deadlines were ridiculous. And I remember it was like 11 o'clock at night one night, and I was like, I lost it. I wrote this email to the management, and I was just like, this is untenable. Like, I'm concerned for the mental health of my staff. Like, this is absolutely untenable. You're making people work weekends, and you're not actually offering them overtime. You're just offering them time off in lieu. I'm like, but it's not just a one-off thing. Like, you're constantly asking again and again and again. And so I had a couple of staff that were like, no, I'm not doing that. And I was like, yeah, that's fine. You know, I get it. But those staff were like, you know, oh, they're not a team player. I'm like, no, they are a team player. They just honor their own boundaries. Yeah. Like, they honor their weekend. We shouldn't be punishing people because they honor their own boundaries. Like, that's a you problem, because you don't like when people set their boundaries, because it means that you can't just push people over and make them do what you want them to do. And I think that, you know, it really comes down to, like, I did equate this, and I think it's only because I had that particular experience growing up, but I did equate this to like a domestic violence situation, in that it is like abusive, and we don't call it that, but that's actually what it is. Because if you look at abuse and the way that, you know, all of these sorts of behaviors happen through those particular types of relationships, you can actually correlate it to a lot of workplaces. And I mean, I know that that sounds pretty dark, but it actually is quite true. Like, if you step back and you go, oh, wow, like that behavior actually, you know, you're not respecting my boundaries. You're telling me what I meant to think. You're doing all of these things. If you're looking at that in a way of like, you know, this coercive control,
Psychological.
that's actually, yeah, but and coercive control. So like, there's a really good book by Jess Hill, who is an Australian reporter here, and it's called See What You Made Me Do, and it's all about domestic violence, actually, in very different sort of circumstances, and it really explains the kind of, well, the process of how people get to that point. Like, because, you know, there's this kind of, I guess, stereotype of being like, well, why doesn't she just leave? Or why don't they just leave? But it's so much more complicated than that. And you actually get to that point in a workplace too, where it does become more complicated than that, because you're so in it that you can't see outside of that how crazy some of this stuff is. And I think that was the really interesting thing for me, was when we started working from home, I was like, wow, these people are nuts. Like, are they for real? Like, is this bullshit or what? Like, I mean, you know, do they see how ridiculous this is? And for the most part, they don't. And so, yeah, boundaries is a hard one, because if you don't have an organization that respects boundaries, and it does come back to that communication, it also comes back to that maturity, because when people are, you know, mature enough to have a conversation and actually be like, you know, I have all this work on, and if you want me to keep doing this, I'm going to have to drop this, this, and this. if they don't have the maturity to have that conversation, then it's hard. And I started doing that. I really started implementing that with my manager. I was like, look, this is the workload, and these are all the other things that you want me to do. And these things are going to take time. Like, this is not just I'm not going to be working till 2 a.m. every day just to service these things. Like, no, that's not going to happen. If you want these done, then this and this is not going to be done. And I think that starting to have those conversations really helps to start to set those boundaries, because it kind of questions it in a way that's palatable. Instead of sitting there and being like, no, I'm setting my boundaries and I'm not doing that. Actually sitting there and being like, look,
it's like you have to justify, like, I can't do X amount of work because this X amount of work will take plus 3 hours. So we have to, I think, talk this way. It's like we have to show in terms of how many hours task A does, huh?
Yeah, and how complicated the tasks are as well. And so, this is why I find like Cal Newport's work very interesting, particularly when it comes to deep work, because so much of the work that we do, as I said before, is like very quick and it's not really well thought out. And actually, if we did spend the time and had those proper boundaries in place to be like, I'm not available between this time and this time because I'm purely focusing on this research work, or I'm writing this paper, or I'm doing whatever, and I need to not be distracted. And I think that, being in an office situation sometimes is actually the worst place to be because you're constantly distracted. Like, I remember the transition back into the office after we'd been, in lockdown for a bit. And oh my God, the few days that I was in there, I got nothing done because everyone wants to talk to you. And like, you spend so much time having chats with people, or like going and asking a simple question that takes so much longer than it would have if you were like just messaging them or on a quick phone call. So, like, I think it's interesting when it comes to boundaries, because there's also a big lack of boundaries in an office situation too. And so, like, you can sit there and put your headphones on to try and like make it a bit of a signal that I'm not to be interrupted because I'm busy. And that does work as well. But also, like, I think that we do need to get better at having those conversations of being like, if you want this done, then these things are not going to be able to happen. And also, like, being realistic about things. I don't actually think that there's all that many people that are taking the piss out of work. Like, I think that that's where a lot of management gets a bit, concerned. They're like, oh, everyone's working from home. They're not really working. They're just pretending. I don't think that that's actually happening, because I know that when people are working from home, they're trying to prove themselves even so much more. And that's when we lack the boundaries too, because we're so busy trying to prove that we're doing great work from home so that we don't have that taken away from us.
Yes.
Which is ridiculous as well, because it comes down to a trust thing.
We tend to work more, I think, when we work from home. That's what I've experienced. Like, you tend to go the extra mile to prove.
Totally.
Yeah. And you said something really interesting. It resonated with me. It's like headphones. I think that's my go-to thing. I wear headphones morning and night at work because it's like a way to put a boundary, because when you're concentrated on your work, you don't want to be, interrupted here and there. So I think that's a good thing. And another thing that I saw in workplaces about meetings. I don't know how it is in Sydney, but I think there's a lot of meaningless. How is it? Meaningless.
Oh,
meetings.
Yeah.
People will put meetings according to their agenda. So if ever you have something important, they won't consider. So these little things that we don't pick up on, but I think there needs to be a system put in place about meetings, because so much time is wasted in meetings, and my schedule might not fit in like a meeting in, you understand what I mean? So
Totally. Yeah. Look, there's lots of meaningless meetings. Absolutely. And I think meetings have been this thing that has been like a go-to. It's like, oh, if we've got something to talk about, let's just have a meeting about it. But we don't really know why we're meeting about it. It's just like spitballing. And I think the really interesting thing about some meetings is that it becomes homogenous thinking as well, because people just get in a room and then they all say, like, someone will be the loudest talking or whatever, and then everyone just agrees. And you're not really getting everyone's opinion or their point of view either. And so there's much better ways to do meetings. There's also a lot of companies have, I've noticed this, that a lot of companies have like picked a day where they have meeting-free days. So yeah, so they have like meeting-free days and like no one can have a meeting on those days. And I think that that's great, because I actually think that we meet too much in a lot of senses. Like, the purpose of meetings is not defined, and that makes for a shitty meeting. If you don't have a purpose of an agenda and outcomes that you're wanting to achieve, or, you know, reasons that you're meeting, then there's really no point. I mean, I must say that I found, particularly when we started working from home, there was so many more meetings because they all wanted to do these like check-ins. And so you spent half your day, like half your morning, in these like kind of bullshit meetings, because it's like, oh, you know, this is where we're up to and blah, 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 blah. And I mean, for the most part, like, it was purposeless. And, you know, meetings go for too long. Like, everyone will put in like an hour or, you know, whatever for a meeting that could have been a 10-minute chat. I think a lot of meetings end up being that they're deferring to people higher up for decisions, instead of actually taking some agency and some responsibility, because no one wants to take responsibility for a decision. Yeah. And so that's where you end up with these meetings happening all the time, because no one actually wants to decide. They actually do want the groupthink, and that's what ends up happening. You end up with groupthink. Atlassian is an incredible company to take a look at. They do some great stuff. I know that there's like they talk about like useless meetings basically, and they do have a bit of a thing where there's like a guide to doing better meetings. But I think as a company, like, you need to decide on what's important and what's not. And as a team, even go, okay, well, we've got all these meetings set up that are just set up because they have been. Are they really necessary? Like, do we really need to have them? Or can it be an email? And I mean, that's the interesting thing. Like, email actually started off as like the memos that used to go out, you know, like it was to replace like all these big long memos. And so, you know, I'm not saying that email is the answer either, because I don't think that it is. But there's definitely a time and a place for meetings. And I think, you know, we need to think better and work smarter about, you know, about things too. But also I do feel like people put in meetings just to make themselves feel important. Like, I used to work with this girl who, honestly, you'd have a 5-minute conversation with her on the phone, and the next minute she was setting a meeting about that particular conversation. And I'm like, okay, I didn't realize we needed to have a meeting about this. But anyway, like, next minute, we got a half an hour meeting about stuff, like with all the executive and that. And, you know, I remember being thrown into meetings where they're like, oh, I don't know anything about that. Like, you just talk about it. And I'm like, I don't know anything about it either, but sure, whatever. Like, my gosh, like, what are we doing here?
I think it's the thing, because I see people running from meeting to meeting, and they say to me, Mary Grace, I didn't do anything because of meetings. And they will have to work extra hours to compensate for all of these meetings. So I think there needs to be like a system in order to regulate all of these meaningless meetings. But I have a question for you. The fact that you speak out your truth, in your company, how are you regarded? How are you regarded from your surroundings at work? I'm really curious.
So I guess part of it is like I've begun speaking up because I haven't been in a company. I left the public service, and that gave me the opportunity to speak up and to speak out. Because when you're in those environments, you're not allowed to. It's actually part of your contract in that you actually can't talk about certain things, but also you are in environments where even if you were to try and position yourself as a thought leader or anything like that, because if you're not in that leadership position, then you kind of get undermined at work. So yeah, I think that, like, leaving that environment has helped me to speak out, but also part of that has been that I've met so many people who feel so stuck in those environments too. I get messages from people who are like, I love what you write on LinkedIn, but I can't even like it because my company is so toxic that if anyone sees that I've liked something a little bit controversial that you've said, there'll be ramifications for that, so I think that that's really like opened my eyes to just see how silenced people are in so many respects, particularly with companies. And I think I see it from both sides. Like, I do understand why a lot of companies have that in place because they, reputational, all the rest of it. But in some respects, it's at their own detriment too, because you're not allowing people to be themselves, but you're also not allowing them to formulate their own kind of stance in the world. And that's not to say that it has to be aligned with the company that they're working with, because just because you work there doesn't mean that you agree with everything. It's like anything. Like, if you're part of a group, it doesn't mean that you agree with every single thing that they stand for. But you might agree with like 80% of it, but still you'll have your own point of view on certain things and your own environments, that like environmental experiences that you've had that inform your opinion of things. So yeah, like, I do feel like leaving that environment has helped me to speak out, and that hasn't been an easy thing to do either, because it's hard to decondition yourself from those environments in a lot of ways, because we are so conditioned to be compliant and complicit in those narratives. And yeah, look, it's been a journey and it hasn't been easy. I think time, and I think as you get older, I feel like you kind of you don't give a shit as much. You just kind of go, you know what, like, this is who I am. This is, this is how it is. This is the way that I see the world. And those things change too. Like, just because this is a point of view at this point in time doesn't mean that that's not going to change. But it's the observations from the curiosity that I've had around, witnessing not only my visceral experience, but people that I've spoken with and friends. And yeah, like, it's kind of heartbreaking to see just how prolific this is everywhere. Like, it's not contained to a particular country or a particular company or a particular industry. It is like everywhere. And it's quite awful.
Yeah.
We talk about bullying and we talk about, all these different things that companies, say that they, will get rid of and all the rest of it. But the words and the actions are very different. And I think until there's a bit more of, until we're cracking open what's really going on and stop silencing people, and be that, like, silencing them through different ways, like not really listening to them is a form of silencing them. just giving them surveys and not having a meaningful conversation is silencing people. We need to have these, like, stand for some things, because at the end of the day, like, and I mean, this is probably very controversial to say as well, but it's like, it may as well be modern slavery, you know, like you've basically gotten to the point where you're not listening to people and you're telling them what to do. Like that in and of its essence is like, you know, it's totalitarian. But also, like, you know, you're not allowing people to show up as their full selves. And I mean, I remember having this conversation, like I was in a performance review, which I find fascinating, because I think performance reviews are the biggest load of nonsense. Like it's so one-sided, and to the point where like some companies don't even give people certain ratings because they don't want to give people bonuses, so therefore they'll underrate them and all this sort of thing. Like it's all very like, it's all very manipulated, and it's not very truthful at all. But like I remember this conversation around this performance discussion, and they were like, oh, you haven't shown up as your full self. And I'm like, well, you don't have an environment here to allow people to show up as their full self. Like that hasn't happened. And so when you're not allowing people to show up as their full self, then of course they're going to be afraid to speak out. Of course they're not going to have self-confidence. Of course they're going to feel like they're not able to perform and they're not able to give their all, because you're not nurturing an environment to actually make that happen. So yeah, speaking up has been a journey, and I'm still on it. Like, you know, there's no answer. I don't have the answers to things. I'm still learning. But I think the more that we're able to speak about things, the more that we're able to have these hard discussions, and, you know, shine a light on things that don't get spoken about, that people do want to silence. I think that only then are we able to change things, and only then are we able to really make a difference. Yeah, that's just how I see it at the moment.
That's great. You know, on LinkedIn, that's where you can see, I think, people struggling. I saw a lot of posts about burnout, about toxic environment, and it's sad to see. It's sad to see where we are going. You understand? And on LinkedIn, you see it like a lot, and I think that's great. People reaching out to you, but still they are afraid to voice out their opinion. So that's sad. And there's something I really wanted to ask you. Was in one of your episodes on your podcast, Not Compliant Enough, you talked about David Graeber's theory of bullshit jobs.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I really want to talk about that, because on LinkedIn, we can see those fancy job descriptions, which are longer than my head.
Yeah, totally.
Longer than my hand, and when you read it, you need a dictionary, because those words are very deep. You get my point.
Yeah.
So
Oh, totally.
it goes to show that they use a lot of fancy words to attract employees, and employees they see that the job is not what was reflected on that LinkedIn post. And I think those employees tend to go, and there's that problem of retention. So, but before talking about retention of talents, can you tell us more about that bullshit job? Because I think it's very important.
Look, I mean, I just feel like everyone needs to read that book, because it's actually incredible. It's very insightful. I think it talks to a lot of how capitalism has proliferated bullshit jobs. It talks to how jobs are, you know, when you look at it at its essence, say you have a company and you want to look important, so you're going to have a receptionist, and you're going to have assistants, and you're going to have different departments, and you're going to build this empire that makes it look like it's really important. Actually, I know a guy who started a company, and it was like an events hire company, and he had like created fake people that worked in his company to like email different people. So he had like someone from accounts and, like these different people to make it look like it was bigger than what it was, right? So to make it look like it wasn't just him. And so that's part of what bullshit jobs like really covers. It covers like, the different types of bullshit jobs. And it talks about how some of them, it really goes into depth about how these jobs actually do destroy people's sense of self and their sense of well-being, because they have no purpose, because the jobs in themselves are purposeless, because they're bullshit, right? So when you don't have a job that you can see any purpose in, then you're not going to be doing your best job. You're not going to be showing up as your best self. And also, like, I think we've come to this point where the job title has become this like thing where, it's become very fancy and everything. But actually, when you get down to the depth of it, it's like you just work on reception, or you are a concierge, or you're working in a supermarket as a checkout person, or, you're working as a nurse or whatever, like, but they've created these fancy titles to make them sound more important than what they are. And I think that that's mainly around management positions, mostly. Like, a lot of management positions are definitely like conflated. And yeah, I just think when it comes down to titles, like, it almost becomes this like keeping up with the Joneses, if you will. Like, it's about, oh, that company has this role and that sounds really good, so let's do that here. It's like everyone kind of copies each other and they make it sound more important than what it is. But also, I think people see through that too, because you can't have these fancy titles and then step out what the job is actually entailing without kind of showing that it's a bullshit job, without showing that it's like, oh no, this is actually what it is. And it should be called something different. But because we want to like be fancy, we're going to like, call it something else. And there's different types of that too. But yeah, look, I just think particularly when it comes to jobs, like, I just feel like the world has changed so much, and we're so stuck in the 80s. Like, the mindset of corporates is so stuck back in, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It really hasn't moved on. It's like that Wolf of Wall Street mentality, and it hasn't changed. Not really, anyway. It's all about profit. It's all about shareholders. It's not about people. And like, until we're going to move from these like shareholders and stakeholders and profit discussions and actually have discussions about people first, then the proliferation of bullshit jobs is just going to keep happening. Because, this is why there's so many layoffs as well, right? We've got all these layoffs happening in tech companies right now because they've scaled too quickly, because they've scaled, at a time where everyone was in lockdown, at a time where people wanted their services, and then they don't want them anymore, or their service offerings have needed to change. And so therefore they've had to scale up really quickly, got a whole bunch of people, and now they're laying them all off. I mean, and they're doing it in ways that are entirely inhumane. I mean, people are logging onto their laptop and they're realizing that they've been like fired. I mean, it's
for Twitter, right? Like, people are getting
their
personal email saying they are no more needed at work.
Literally. Like, it's awful. And I mean, where did this sort of behavior come from? Like, how is this okay? And so, yes, okay, obviously these jobs weren't needed, right? But you created them for a reason. And so what was that reasoning? How have you inflated your staffing levels so much that you can get rid of hundreds of jobs in one go? And it's not just a little amount of people, like we're talking hundreds of people in one go.
100.
That's a lot, like that's a lot, hundreds to thousands. So who was building their own little empire? Like, and that's essentially what bullshit jobs is around as well. It's like building an empire, right? People like to build their own little fiefdoms and their little empires. And so in order to make themselves look more important, if they have more people working for them, then they're the ones that are more important, which I just think is the grossest thing ever, right? Like, you just want bums on seats to make you look important. Like, what is wrong with you?
Yeah.
Actually,
And
like, what is wrong with you?
yeah, and there's that issue that I'm seeing as well, observing, is the retention of talent. So we have a lot of people who are talented, they have the capabilities, but there's a system around that. As soon as they're not getting what they expect from that people, okay, you're no more needed. But the thing is, are we having an environment where the person can show what he can do? You understand? And
Yeah,
I think nowadays retention is not a priority for companies. They prefer to hire than retain. But is it not more costly to hire more?
100%.
Like, if you give time,
Absolutely.
yeah, if you give time, you set an environment where the person can feel at ease to show their capabilities. I think that's the best thing. But now, because of that, you're not providing you're not giving what we want, so bye-bye. But the self-esteem of that person, I think this is causing a lot of harm in regards to confidence. And that
Of
is so sad.
course.
I think that is so sad that people are not retaining talents and they are just like, okay, we are not satisfied. Okay, you want to go by.
I mean, you do make such an excellent point there. Like, yeah, it does. It costs more to be hiring people than it does to be retaining them. Absolutely. Like 100%, it costs way more because you've got to advertise it, you've got to onboard them, you've got to get equipment for them, you've got to train them. Da, 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 da. Like, you've already done that with these people that are there. I think that the reason that like companies like to just not retain people in some respects is because they get fresh blood in, they get fresh meat, they get people that they can
Mold.
mold into a different way. Exactly. And I was going to say manipulate, but yeah, mold is kind of nice.
We can say
But there is this like idea that getting new people in is the answer. And actually, with the way of the world and the way of a lot of companies, yes, they're laying a lot of people off, but there's also a lot of companies that can't find people. And then you also have this other area where you have people who are very highly skilled who can't get jobs because they're too overqualified. It is those things where if you do retain people, then you are able to really grow your business in a way that's actually going to help so much more. And like, retention is so much easier to kind of mitigate than retrenchment. And so like, if you're laying people off because of your bottom line, then that's not a meaningful like way to operate. I mean, you're still going to have to, like, if it's all to balance the books, you're still going to have to do that in 6 months or every quarter. So like, how many people are you going to lay off to make that happen? How many people does it take for you to balance your books, but also still be producing what you need to? If companies don't retain staff, if they're not focused on retaining staff, it's going to be very challenging for them to attract new staff. As I said before, people have options now, particularly young kids. I mean, if I was 18 right now, I would be like, I'm not going to some corporation. Yeah, 100%. I'd be like, yeah, girl, I'm on TikTok and like YouTube and, Twitch and whatever else. Like there's other options out there. And this is what a lot of companies are not getting through their thick skulls. They think, oh, but we're so established and people want to work for us because we're amazing. Well, maybe you are, but unless there's some reason that people really want to come and work for you, unless there's some real deep attraction there, then it's going to be really hard for you to actually get staff. And it doesn't matter how big you are. And I know that you just like get more people in, spit them out, get them in, spit them out. But you can only do that for so long. And like your reputation precedes you. And so if you're building a reputation where, you're scaling hard and then you're getting rid of people in a really heartless way, then who's going to go work for you? I don't care how big you are. Like, I think the reputation of like Twitter and, all these companies, like however many tech companies, because basically all of them have had massive layoffs, like Salesforce, Twitter, GitLab, like a whole bunch of companies, and they're all done in different ways, right? I'm not saying that every single one of them is heartless, but there's definitely been a lot of that. And I don't know whether that's a cultural thing, being a lot of American companies. Like, I don't know. But you're also a global company and you're not doing it to just people in the US. You're doing it to people everywhere.
People, yeah.
And, we are a more global like world. I mean, people work for companies all over the world and they don't have to be co-located with that company. So yes, retention is way more important, but also retention is part of your reputation. Like if you're walking into an organization and you're being like, oh, everyone here's new. I mean, I'm going to be like, are you a startup? Or if you've been around for a while, like, where's your corporate knowledge? Because that's what you get with people that you have retained, is they have the corporate knowledge. They're the ones that can say, we tried this 5 years ago and this was the outcome. And yeah, maybe let's pull that out of the box and try it again, because maybe now's the right time. Or we tried this and it didn't work and it's not going to for these reasons. Like there's reasons that you have people, that you retain them. I mean, some of the people that I've worked for have been like walking encyclopedias, of a company. And that's incredible. Some people found them really annoying as those people. And I'm like, I get it. They're cute and old and like a little bit crazy about some stuff, but like they know what's going on. And if you ask them something, they can not just turn around and be like, oh, that's just because that's the way we do it here. They can give you a detailed explanation of things. And so, yes, your retention is your reputation in so many ways too.
That's so beautifully said. Your retention is your reputation. And I think that it goes with what you said as well, how to show appreciation at work, the 5 languages. I think that is very important. It's not just on those Women's Day or Happiness Day that we show people we appreciate them. Is by like on a day-to-day. I think it's not just about managers or team leaders or HR. Is us as colleagues. How can we show up at work showing those different love languages? I find it so meaningful and interesting. Like how I can show you as a colleague that I value you. Can you tell us more about that love languages?
Yeah, sure. So Dr. Gary Chapman talks about the 5 love languages, and a lot of people use that with their interpersonal relationships. So, be it their partner, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever that looks like for you. And I know that through a lot of I know this is an example, like some friends of mine were getting married, and so they were getting married in the Catholic Church. And as part of that, as part of like their, discussions before they got married, they had to have some open and honest discussions about their love languages. And this just shows how people are appreciated. So when it comes to love languages, there's 5 love languages that Dr. Gary Chapman has identified. That is acts of service, meaningful, like, so touch, so acts of service, touch, gifts, like, so giving gifts,
Words, I think words of
words of affirmation. Yep.
like today
And
you did a great job, like well done.
yeah,
These little
absolutely.
things.
Words of affirmation, and quality time, right? So there's sort of the 5 ones, and him and another guy kind of adapted that to the workplace. So they do have the like languages of appreciation, and there's a book on that, and that's what I was sort of referring to in the podcast episode. So first of all, it's about figuring out how you like to be valued and how you like to feel appreciated and how you like to feel loved. And, you know, that's probably going to be different in a work situation versus a personal relationship or even a friendship, right? But mostly a lot of people will find that it's the same type of things, because usually your love language, and this is going a bit deeper, is usually your love language is something that maybe you didn't get when you were growing up, right? So say you had parents that were at work all the time and they never spent any quality time with you, then that would be something that you really appreciate, because it was something that you never got shown. And it's not to name and shame parents or anything like that. Like, we've all had different upbringings, but it does help to identify for you what maybe you were lacking in those early developmental phases of your life. And so that is how you generally feel most appreciated. And so, you know, obviously we don't want to get into a deep and meaningful all the time with our staff and with our colleagues and with, you know, with our leaders and stuff. But what we can do is use those types of exercises. You know, you can do it like an online, like a little online test thing, which I'm pretty sure is on Dr. Gary Chapman's website. And you can figure out which love language you are, or which language of appreciation you are. And so by having that knowledge of yourself, by having that self-awareness of how you like to feel appreciated, you can then vocalize that to other people and be like, you know what, like, I really do appreciate that meeting time, because for me, that is like you showing me quality time. Or I really appreciate you giving me amazing feedback, because they're words of affirmation to me, and that's how I feel appreciated. Or I really love the fact that you've dropped a bunch of flowers on my desk, or a chocolate, or something like that, because receiving gifts makes me feel appreciated. So there's all these different nuances, because everyone's different, right? And so it's about figuring out, you know, not only how you like to be appreciated, but how other people like to be appreciated. And so, you know, doing that in ways that is meaningful for them. And I think as managers, it's a really important way to help with providing some team cohesiveness too, like, so building that team. And I think some people are better at this than others, because they're a bit more self-aware, or they've got that maturity or whatever. And, you know, some people just intuitively can recognize that and work to it, you know. But yeah, figuring out how you like to feel appreciated, but how your team likes to be appreciated. And when you're doing it in a much larger scale, you actually need to incorporate all of it, right? Like, you need to incorporate all of those things into one thing. So maybe you're doing like a town hall meeting with your whole company. You know, you might have like, there's a cafe down the road who are doing like, you know, they'll do a deal with you where you can give everyone a free coffee or something. So you drop that on everyone's seat, and then you know, give them really good feedback in certain teams of the work that they've done. So the words of affirmation. And those particular people that have done really well, or maybe they get to have lunch with you or something like that, you know, that quality time. So there's ways to incorporate it that doesn't cost a lot of money. And it's very meaningful to people. But I think, you can't get to that point of appreciating people without understanding where they're at and really getting to the bottom of, you know, some of the things that are going on underneath, particularly when you've got some toxic workplace situations happening. Like, you can't just go from, oh, we're just going to appreciate everyone and then they'll be fine. We actually need to speak about the skeletons in the closet. We need to really uncover what's going on before we can meaningfully appreciate people, because otherwise it's just going to look like another platitude. Otherwise it's just going to look like another ticking the box, and it's not going to mean anything. And I think that that's the difference as well. Like, yes, you can figure out how people want to be appreciated, but you also need to do it in a way that's meaningful and actually matters.
Yeah. It makes the difference. You said on your podcast, like, nowadays, the reward of doing your work quickly and in the right ways to get more jobs, more work. But I think
more work, yeah.
the reward should be to feel appreciated. I think that should be like a pillar. Yeah.
I mean, it is hard though, like, and I have been in that position before, and I will, you know, put my hand up and say, yeah, I was that manager. Like, you know, I was rewarding my staff with more work because we were just so drowning in work that, like, we needed to get stuff done. But I also was really cognizant about that, and I was like, look, I know that I'm doing this, but also it's for a short period of time. Like, this is not a forever thing.
Yeah.
And I would make sure that those people got extra time off, or, you know, I'd be like, look, can you do this? And, like, you know, just start late tomorrow or something like that. So I think it's about making it balanced and actually helping to balance people's workloads. And yeah, stop punishing people for doing good work quickly, because, you know, it burns people out. Like, that's actually what ends up happening. We end up with burnout. We end up with, yeah, people just, like, you know, they get fed up because they're like, well, you're not appreciating me. You're just giving me more work. And sure, that's fine, but it's not sustainable.
And I think to wrap up everything, it's like, nowadays I think we need to learn how to reset. We need to learn how to, you know, schedule some leisure time in all of this work. I think it's really important for us to be alone, you know, to love our own company. You understand what I mean? It's like we need to learn just to do nothing at all, not to be in that I need to perform, I need to hustle, I need to produce work. You understand? So I think we
Yeah,
need to sit alone with ourselves and just reflect.
absolutely. I think so much of it is actually about, you know, knowing yourself, because we're so used to other people telling us who we're meant to be and what we're to be doing. And it's not necessarily about doing all the time. And I think so much of this busyness is actually trying to escape ourselves.
Yeah.
You know, like, we become busy so that we don't actually have to sit with ourselves and go, okay, well, what's really going on? And, you know, look, not everyone can afford to go to therapy. Not everyone can afford to have, you know, beautiful, luxurious massages and holidays and all of those things. But what we can do is go for a walk, be in nature, reconnect to who we are. And there's some research out there that actually says that, like, even just 20 minutes of journaling a day can actually help to really change your perception. And it actually helps you to kind of almost, like, you know, you have the answers within you. And people don't want to hear that, because they want someone else to tell them what they need to do. You know, we've become this society where we're seeking the answers outside of ourselves so much. And actually, that's not the answer at all, because you're never going to get the right answer. It's never going to be the right thing, because you know in yourself. And that's the most frustrating thing. Like, believe me, when people told me that before, I was like, screw you, I just want you to tell me what's going on. Like, just help me.
True.
But actually, you know, it's because we're disconnected with ourselves. We're disconnected from nature. We're in these environments that aren't actually helpful to us. You know, it's not natural for us to be sitting in a corporate environment at a computer at our desk every day. It's just not.
Yeah.
And we get to hear ourselves so much more when we're near an ocean, when we're in a park, when we're in the forest, when we're in nature, because we are nature. We've just forgotten it.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And that disconnect, I think, is because we tend to put our identity in our work. It's like as if we have to prove something. Some people's life revolves around their work. And I think it is because of traumas or bondages. You understand what I mean? And if you don't have that journaling time where you mother yourself and you get to have those hard conversation on paper, I think this type of conversation with yourself maybe will lead you to understand that you're going on a path that is not where you should go. Like, don't put your identity in your work. I think without that conversation, you can get lost.
Absolutely. And also the energy, you know, like we put our identity, but also all of our energy and our creative currency into work. And, you know, we do it at a detriment to ourselves. You know, we do it because we're like, oh, you know, we like the accolades. We like people, you know, giving us praise and telling us that we're amazing. But we don't do it for ourselves a lot of the time. And yes, you're entirely right. Like people go into that identity of, you know, this is who I am because this is what I do. But we're so much more than what we do as work. Like we're so much more than that. And we don't need to use work as an excuse. We don't need to hide from ourselves in work. And I mean, you know, it's just another numbing agent. Like there's all these numbing agents, you know, like there's alcohol, there's drugs, there's workaholism, there's exercise, you know, there's exercising, there's being busy. Like all of those are some of them more socially acceptable, others not so much. But work is a socially acceptable, you know, numbing agent, really. It's socially acceptable. Oh, you're working really hard. Oh, that's okay. But at what cost? At what cost to your health? At what cost to your mental health? At what cost to your life? You know? So it is very important to not just be work, but to recognize that it is part of your life, and it is a big part of your life. Like we spend a lot of time there generally, but it's not all that we are, and it's not all that we do. And there's so much that we can learn from ourselves by just being in nature, by reconnecting to the cycles of nature, to reconnecting to who we are, who we were before we were institutionalized into education systems or to corporate systems or to any of these other systems.
Yeah.
I
think that's a beautiful way to finish on that beautiful note, like to go back to, you know, the most important thing is to reconnect with ourselves and nature. And if you had to say a last word to people struggling in a toxic environment or is trying to put boundaries but can't, what would you tell them?
Oh, that is such a good question. I would say you are not alone. You are not alone, and you are more than enough.
Yeah. Nice. Thank you.
And keep repeating that to yourself.
Should be embedded in every cell. Like,
literally.
I'm good enough. My worth is not in your hand. It is in mine.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's beautiful.
Karista, I want to thank you so much because you're I don't know if you realize you're a treasure trove.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for the time. Thank you so much for your time and for everything you've shared with us. And I really hope that people will get inspired by your words, I'm sure. And even more on your podcast. So I highly encourage people to go and see Karista's podcast, listen to Not Compliant Enough, because it is an amazing space and you feel like home. On your podcast,
Oh,
you feel like home. So thank you so much. And where can people connect with you, maybe share their stories with you, or even ask for help if needed, like advice? Where can they reach out to you?
yeah, sure. So, yeah, you can find me on my podcast, Not Compliant Enough. I also have a website called intuitivelycreate.com. And on that, you can set up a time. We can do one-on-one sessions to work through whatever it is that you're going through. I do a lot of work with flower essences as well. It's challenging to send them globally at the moment. So if you're in Australia, we can do flower essences, but also, yeah, I've done a lot of work with lots of different modalities, which are very easily translated into an online space as well. So yeah, individually, but also with corporations, if you're looking to really reset your culture and have a chat about that, then yeah, here to help.
Reach out to Karista and on LinkedIn as well. Go and
Yeah,
read
LinkedIn.
a long form.
I would
Thank
I would say, yeah, LinkedIn's probably the space. I do have Instagram, but I'm probably more active on LinkedIn because that is where most people I find who are needing this sort of work are really located. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. It was such a great time. I didn't see the time.
I don't know either. I'm like,
Thank you for your
no idea.
generosity and keep up that amazing work. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much, lovely.